Hi there, welcome back to my channel. Sorry for not posting in quite a while. It's just I was quite busy for over the Christmas period and then I got sick for a while. So I'll try to post more frequently now. But this video will be about grammar and more specifically the best way of learning it and my advice. So at school, normally the approach is to learn it a lot, sometimes way too much, and to do lots of exercises, read lots of explanations. And if you look at any of the percentages of the people that actually can speak languages after learning at school, it's very low. So I don't really think that's a very successful method for learning a language, just because it takes time away from learning words, phrases, and listening and practicing speaking. Most of the time, you know the grammar very well, but you can't speak very well. Uh, Another approach is that of Rosetta Stone, which I don't like either. That approach is basically no grammar explanations at all, and you're supposed to understand the grammar from context and pictures alone, and just through repetition, you're supposed to understand. The problem with this is normally, I mean, with simple grammar rules, it can work, but for really complicated things, like say, I don't know, grammatical cases in Russian, for example, that's ridiculously hard, and you just from seeing a picture and context, you can't understand when I'm supposed to use this. Like it's way too complicated for that. So that has also a lot of disadvantages as well, because a lot of the time you can memorize the phrases, but you don't actually fully understand it, which is a problem.
Here I'll show you an example of what Rosetta Stone is like. So instead of explaining the rules, it will just show you a picture and then give you some text and dialogue, and you're supposed to understand from that. So, for example, here it would show a picture of one dog and say Adna Sabaka. It would show a picture of two dogs and say Dve Sabaki. And then it would show a picture of five dogs and say Piat Sabak. Now, you can't really understand much from this. All you understand really is the endings change, and that's it. It doesn't tell you why this is happening, what rule is there, which endings do I use. And if someone asked you, could you do this for could you say one person, two people, five people? Could you? No, because you don't know which rule. You don't know the rule, so it's really not that useful.
So the approach I use is kind of a combination of the two, I guess. It's I would say about maybe 80% of words, phrases, listening, just content basically, and about 20% is grammar. So normally I'll at the start there are things I have to know. For example, pronouns, tenses, how they work, verbs, how they work. But the rest of it I just ignore and just try to understand. So I'll try to understand, and when I don't understand something, then I will look up the grammar. And I can give you some examples. So the first example is from when I was learning Italian, and I would see just a simple past tense form would be to use have and then another form of the verb, like we do in English, like I have said. So you see an example sentence, ha detto qualcosa, which is literally has said something. He has said something. So I would see this and I would understand it's just past tense. He said something. But then I would then sometimes I would see, which was really weird, avvenuto ieri, for example. And I would read this and it literally means is come or is came yesterday. Like he is came, and I would think like what is this the same? Why is it using it? And it's just very strange. So I would see this constantly, and I would ignore it at first. I would just try to understand, and maybe translate the whole sentence, and work it out from context what it means. Then eventually, I kept seeing this, and I want to understand. So I want to understand it. I've seen it enough, and I look up the rule, and the rule is that certain verbs use essere, to be, instead of to have. So you just have to memorize these words or these certain verbs, and that's the rule. So So with some experience and looking up the rule, I learnt this rule. Here's another example. So while learning French, I would see two forms of the word day. And so say, for example, I would see the word journée and I would see the word jour. And they would both have the translation of day in English. So I would see, for example, il était là toute la journée, or il était là pour un jour. And they would both be translated as day, and I think, what's the difference? Why is that there? I looked this up immediately just to see the difference, and it's actually quite a complicated explanation. Like they basically mean the same thing. It's just they use one form in certain situations, another form in other situations. I don't remember the rule because it's quite complicated, but one of those things I think, okay, so they use it in different contexts. I won't memorize the rule right now because I'm not experienced enough, and I'll basically memorize the rule later. So sometimes you don't need to memorize the rules straight away. You can just understand that there's a difference and then learn them later. The last example is when I was learning Russian, and it was something that I basically ignored for about a year because I knew I wouldn't be able to understand it, and it was so strange. Which what also doesn't help is these things I found don't really have names in Russian, but it's something I'll make a future video about. So basically, I would see these strange constructions like "Dilia того чтобы," or "O tom как," or "Tom что," which translate literally as "for that, in order to," or "about that," and it's just like, what? But I ignored these for a year, and then I tried finding explanations, and I couldn't really find any. Then I would basically just write them down every time I found them and see them in context, and I was able to work out what they mean and why they're used through experience. And sometimes you need experience in a language to understand certain rules. Like you need to have seen these phrases hundreds of times in context, in their meaning, to be able to understand. And that's what I did here. I'll do a future video about this, just because it's quite complicated, and I haven't actually seen any explanations about that. But anyway, so this is how I learn grammar. I don't focus on it as we do in school, and I don't ignore it like we do, like is done in Rosetta Stone. I do I guess in between, where I learn it when I feel like I need it, and also a good way of learning grammar is being corrected. So say if you're talking to someone and they correct you, you can learn rules that way. That's basically it. That's basically how I learn grammar. I hope this was useful advice for anyone learning other languages, and thank you for watching.